Good evening, everyone. I'm Professor Boyadjian with the Armenian Studies program at Fresno State. And I'd like to welcome you to our second presentation in the Armenian Studies program Fall Lecture Series. Tonight's lecture is co-sponsored by the Armenian Studies program and is supported by the Clara Busian Bedrosian Fund. All of our events this semester will be Zoom events, Zoom webinars. After the presentation, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions to our speaker, and I'd like you to use the question and answer function of Zoom. So at the end of the seminar, or even during it, you can ask questions, and then at the end, I'll try to go through it and ask the questions to our speaker. Typically in the fall semester, we have quite a few events. I'd like to share a brief video with you that gives you an idea of some of our upcoming events. And then I'll say a few words about those events in just a minute. Actually, I'm going to, let's see, do this first. So. Sorry, I think maybe you didn't see that, so I'm going to try that again. Sorry. So these are just some of our upcoming events in the Armenian Studies program. I'm looking forward to all of these events, and if you would like to participate, you would use the Zoom registration link that we use for all of our events. This evening, I'm very happy to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Tamar Boyadjian. She is an associate professor of medieval literature and teaches creative writing and poetry and teaches translation courses in the Department of English at Michigan State University. Her academic research and publications primarily focus on the intersections between Europe and the Middle East across the medieval Mediterranean, with a focus also on the Armenian Kingdom of Cilicia. Tonight, her talk will be about her award-winning book called The City Lament, Jerusalem Across the Medieval Mediterranean. And the talk will be about the various ethno-religious cultures across the medieval Mediterranean world that lamented the loss of the city of Jerusalem. Well, that's all I'm going to say because she's the expert. So we're going to let her do all the talking. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker tonight, Dr. Tamar Boyadjian. Tamar?
Thank you so much, Barlow, and good evening, everyone. I'm so happy to be here today. And thank you especially to the Armenian Studies program at Fresno State, Sergio Laporta, and especially Barlow Dermagadichan for inviting me. Also like to give a special thanks to the SAS and to Bedros Dermatosyan for their support. I'm going to share my PowerPoint with everyone. So as Barlow said, I'm going to be talking this evening about my my last book project called The City Lament, Jerusalem Across the Medieval Mediterranean. And I suppose, considering the current situation of the world, that my topic today of lamentation is sadly appropriate. The idea for this book came from the desire to understand how other cultures translated the loss of their land and the spaces that they deemed sacred to them. As someone whose grandparents and parents were deported from their home and could no longer claim something of a homeland, I started to examine more closely what it meant in the medieval Mediterranean world to mourn the loss of fallen cities. I came to find that despite differences, many ethno-religious groups reflected on this topic similarly in their literary traditions. They had to find ways to understand the circumstances of their displacement, to outline a history and connection to a particular land or space, and to think about a future that did not exclude this place in their literary imaginations. I wanted to start my talk today where I think perhaps one should always arguably begin, which is with poetry. I am also a writer who composes in Western Armenian, and I wanted to start today with a poem that I published many, many years ago, which was called Getron, or Center. Եվ եթե հղանա գստելզակորձե, ծնունդ է, քեզ գուղե, անչե գետրոնը, եւ եթե շարժի գփոխվի, արևածագ է, կարելի է իմանալ ուր է գետրոնը, իսկ եթե երթաս կվերաթարնաս, մնայուն է, պիտի ուզեիր քիտնալ, եթե հոսե գետրոնը, իսկ եթե մորնա գիշե, հավիդենական է, պիտի հարցնեիր թուն ես գետրոնը. In the city Lament, Jerusalem across the medieval Mediterranean, I critically evaluate how various ethno-religious cultures across the medieval Mediterranean world lamented the loss of the city of Jerusalem, and in what ways these lamentations are informed by reinscribing models of ancient city laments. And by city lament, I mean a lamentation or a poem of mourning that is written for the loss or the fall of a city, so the capture of a city. And I'm going to return to this poem, Getron, later in my talk. During the period of the Crusades, Jerusalem's status stood contested, and it wavered from the hands of various powers. A number of these traditions, Arabo-Islamic, Cilician Armenian, and the Latin West, produced lamentations over the loss of Jerusalem. My book argues that these lamentations modeled their compositions on ancient Mesopotamian city laments, specifically Akkadian, Sumero-Akkadian, and other Jewish concepts of mourning the loss of cities. And through these lamentations, each of these cultures furthered their political objectives of reconquering Jerusalem by envisioning its own Jerusalem through a textually surrogate geography of the city, also informed by the theological and spiritual tradition of the significance of Jerusalem for that particular faith. It is through these city laments that these cultures allow for their own Jerusalems to live anew through this very paradoxical mourning of its loss and destruction. In my talk today, I would like to draw from the introductory chapter of my book, where I frame the discussion and overview of the history of the city lament. Where and how did the tradition begin? What were common themes, tropes, and attributes? And how was this ritual performatively female? Next, I will move to how the ritual of lamentation, particularly city laments, became treated in the monotheistic world. I start by providing a summary of lament over Jerusalem in the Hebrew Bible. I also discuss what characteristics of lamenting Jerusalem become the basis for future city laments in the medieval period and even arguably today. I then move to the position of the Latin Church and the Old Testament to Lamentations, followed by Jerusalem, city laments, and the Arabo-Islamic tradition, and then a discussion of city laments for the Eastern Christian Church, specifically for the Armenians. This framework supplies the chapters with the necessary context through which they examine an Arabo-Islamic and Cilician Armenian city lament over the loss of Jerusalem, alongside Pope Urban's speeches at Clermont and a lamentation of Richard the Lionheart upon his departure from Jerusalem during the Third Crusade. These are subsequently the topics of each of the chapters of my book. Why does all this matter? I conclude by asking how we could examine these city laments as moments that reflect intercultural exchange and reveal to us that the medieval world was more interconnected than we thought, that our connection to people and their traditions are not divided but interwoven, and that our customs intersect. Can we look at the way people lamented cities as models of sympathy and love, rather than the hate and antagonism that modern day politics demands? Can we forgive and connect when we understand that we were once connected? In this book, I move away from anachronistic readings of the past, which attempt to focus on difference as a means of understanding cultures in the Mediterranean. Lamentation and the language of lament is a universal practice and a universal language. The ritual of lament is ancient. Performative laments evoke power in their communal mourning. They allow a community to negotiate their fate with the gods or their own god. What is a lament? A song and poem of mourning, composed on the occasion of the death of heroes, gods, rulers, important members of the community, but also the loss, destruction, and death, metaphorical death of a city. The genre of the city lament dates back to the ancient Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean world. Dirges formulated over the fall of cities placed the voice of lamentation in the city's tutelary goddess, the same goddess who, upon abandoning the city and its population, brings upon the fall and destruction of that city. One of the most well-recognized city lamentations from this period is the Lament for Ur, a Sumerian lament composed as a result of the fall of the city-state Ur to the ancient pre-Iranic Elamites around the period of 2000 before the Common Era. The Akkadian epic poem Gilgamesh also includes references to the lamenting people of Uruk in Tablet 8, who together with Gilgamesh wail over the death of Enkidu, a wild man created by the protecting gods to stop Gilgamesh from oppressing the people of the city. At the end of the epic, when a violent storm arrives in Tablet 11 and the goddess Ishtar and the other gods depart, the inhabitants engage in lamentation over Uruk, along with Gilgamesh, who, quote, sat down and wept, down his cheek, his tears were coursing. City lamentations appear not only in the cultures of ancient Mesopotamia, but also in the surviving corpus of material from ancient and pre-modern Greece and Rome. For example, Euripides' tragedy Troides, or Trojan Women, produced during the Peloponnesian War in 415, can be considered a story about the capture of the Aegean island of Melos, where 4 Trojan women lament the loss of Troy to the Athenians, including Hecabe, who also expresses anger at the gods for their abandonment of the city. The play, in fact, begins with a lamentation over the fall of Troy by the god Poseidon and the goddess Athena. Homer's Odyssey is in many ways also a reflective lamentation of Troy, as Odysseus journeys to return to home to his fallen city. In Book 8, Odysseus is described as melting into tears after the famous harper recalls in his lament, quote, the death and slaughter that bear down on Troy, and how, quote, Troy was fated to perish. And in his oration delivered in Rhodes after a devastating earthquake that raged the city in 142, the Greek orator and author of the second sophistic, Aurelius Aristides, also draws from the tradition of city lamentations when he bewails the former greatness and beauty of Rhodes, along with an empathetic consolation, forecasting the duty of endurance. The city lament is so universal that in the pagan world of ancient Germanic oral poetry, the Old English epic Beowulf, as well as Anglo-Saxon poetry such as The Wife's Lament, The Wanderer, and The Seafarer, also contain reflections on the loss of space in their lamentations. In ancient societies, ritual lament was a pronounced female activity where women were able to influence community affairs through a public expression. This prominent role of women in lamentation was an unquestionable part of ancient ritual culture, particularly in the sharing of community grief. Female lamenters mourned and appeased the dead. They called to the gods to free suffering, to encourage prosperity of land, and to better the human condition. Women's laments functioned as intercessors within and between the earthly and the heavenly. They were believed to be able to assuage the heart of gods. In the ancient Hittite kingdom that dominated Anatolia during the second millennium before the Common Era, the 14-day funeral ritual for the dead of royalty, the Salis Wastaizi, was performed by Taptara women, specialized wailers who absorbed the anger of the deceased and deflected it from the community. cultural parallels can also be seen across many other cultures, such as the Roman praeficiae, professional women mourners, usually hired by affluent families, that conducted the rituals for the dead, chanting the nenia to accompanying pipe music. Since lament was a female-gendered activity in the ancient world, in many cultures, men had to perform as women in order to lament. We find cross-dressed men lamenting as women in the tragedies of the festival of Dionysius in Athens, as well as in Athenian dramas of the 5th century. In ancient Mesopotamia, male gala priests, typically grouped in temple accounts with singers and musicians, performed lamentations in the Sumerian dialect of Emiso, literally meaning the tongue of women. In fact, one of the main functions of Athenian tragedy, some scholars have argued, was to provide men with the space for this quote-unquote womanish expression of grief and pleasure through tears and lamentation, a quality that the state sought to restrict. Over time, lamentation, whether on stage or in real life, was seen as a threat to the order of the male public sphere. It was believed to undermine the male heroic code. The belief was that to bring a man to tears disabled him from his duty as a warrior. Women's public performance of ritual lament resisted male institutions and discourses. In the process of giving into fate, a woman's practice of mourning with her community simultaneously empowered her ability to not only protest her own fate, but also to take control over her body and place in society. The more the female lamenter evolved men and her community in her own grief, the more power she placed in a relationship with the gods, and ultimately her own fate. Alongside efforts to control and suppress female lamentation was the desire of men to co-opt this mediating power ascribed to women. Beginning in the 6th century, several laws were passed in Athens and other parts of Greece which attempted to restrict lamentation. The goal of these laws was to suppress women's roles in public activity and maintain the power of aristocratic families run by men. These efforts also reflect the attempt of men to take over an already established tradition of female practice and a relationship with the gods ascribed solely to the art of women performers. An interesting parallel comes from the Gabra, a nomadic group living between Kenya and Ethiopia, where men also usurped the practice of female lamentation. Many scholars argue that Mesopotamian city laments, Sumerian, Sumero-Akkadian, and Akkadian, are precursors to those found in the Hebrew Bible, specifically in Ezekiel, Lamentations, and Psalms. In this section, I want to outline the main tropes of lamenting Jerusalem in the Hebrew Bible, which sets foundations for the way in which the medieval Mediterranean world laments cities such as the city of Jerusalem. The pioneering scholar Dobbs Alsop proposes 9 common motifs present in ancient Mesopotamian laments that have influenced lamentations in the Hebrew Bible, and subsequently those composed across the medieval Mediterranean. So these categories are subject and mood, structure and poetic technique, divine abandonment, assignment of responsibility, the divine agent of destruction, the destruction of the city, the weeping goddess, lamentation, and restoration of the city and return of the gods. These laments therefore provide models for the structure of the lament and the trajectory of the development of these sections, the loss of the city, so understanding its downfall, mourning, and possible recovery, and then the city as it is personified as female. In ancient Mesopotamian city laments, the loss of a city is attributed to the communal sins of the inhabitants and the subsequent movement of the protecting god or goddess away from the city. The Hebrew Book of Lamentations, which consists of 5 separate poems mourning the loss of Jerusalem, similarly attributes the destruction of the city to its sinful population and the movement away from God's law. Throughout Lamentations, there is a plea for attention, a desire to renew one's commitment to the temple, and to regain access to Yahweh's presence, where the mourner hopes to be able to praise God in the future. A moral impurity has defiled the land, and the symptom of this immoral behavior is the loss of the city, which becomes expressed figuratively to the personification of Jerusalem as a morally impure female. This prominent trope, which exists across many ancient city laments, emerges from the tradition in Western Semitic cultures of the ancient Near East that consider major cities to be female divine consorts of the male gods whose sanctuaries they protected. So some examples of the way in which the city is personified as female include Ezekiel where the female persona of Jerusalem is used as Yahweh's wife to describe the defilement of the city and the temple through the metaphor of a woman's unfavorable behavior, her infidelity, uncleanliness, and idolatry. The defilement of the land also becomes paralleled with the city as a menstruating woman, and the husband's vengeance on the unfaithful wife metaphorically reflects Yahweh's instigation of the destruction of Jerusalem to Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. Other prominent metaphors include the image of Jerusalem as a widow, a betrayed lover, a mother bereaved of her children. In Ezra, Jerusalem, the mother of all believers, is presented as a persecuted and barren woman. And throughout Lamentations, the now desolate Jerusalem is a widow whose sins have left her in filth and uncleanliness. Quote, all that honored her despise her because they have seen her nakedness. The female city carries the burden of shame, punished for the sins of her people, and only able to express her sorrow through a voice that exists in continuous lamentation. The trope of Jerusalem as a personified female is also arguably influenced by the prominent role of women in ritual lamentation, who, as I mentioned, negotiated the fate of the city and the community with the ruling deity. One striking example of the attempt to shift this prominent role of women into the hands of men appeared in the work of scholar Nancy R. Bowen. Bowen examines the phrase used by Ezekiel, quote, daughters of your people, claiming the reference is an allusion to female prophets of the period. Building on the work of Bowen, Nancy Lee argues for the striking theological and rhetorical impact of an unidentified woman singer's voice, whom she calls the Jerusalem poet, in dialogue with this male voice, Jeremiah. Through an analysis of the Hebrew, Lee and Bowen both suggest that Lamentations is actually a culmination of the voices of female mourners who either stood independently or were in conjunction with a male voice, Jeremiah. So the argument there is that they're practicing the role of lamentation as a communal ritual that was basically ascribed to women. So what are the ways in which the lamenting of the city of Jerusalem in the Hebrew Bible came to be interpreted into Christian thought? Christianity's relationship to Jerusalem and lamentation was defined through the medieval European world through concepts of Jewish identity. Christianity's assertions were primarily dictated by a rejection of Judaism, while at the same time an attempt to still consider the Old Testament as part of the foretelling of the coming of Jesus Christ. This concept is called supersession, where the belief is that the Christian church has superseded the Israelites and the Mosaic covenant. This position also established the church's attitude toward both the city of Jerusalem and lamentation in the medieval period. Christianity's relationship to Jerusalem could therefore be summarized as follows. The earthly Jerusalem is human, sinful, and Jewish, and the heavenly Jerusalem is God and paradise. This dominating theological interpretation can be seen in Paul's letter to the Galatians, where the earthly Jerusalem is presented as being in slavery with his children, whereas the heavenly Jerusalem is mother and free. This belief also asserted that the earthly city was solely the city of the Jews. This position, however, held an internal contradiction since Christianity attempted to both inherit the Old Testament and the essential position of Jerusalem and reject it at the same time. This paradox did not allow for the earthly Jerusalem to be completely ignored, and the city eventually reasserted its position in the secular sphere as a destination of pilgrimage and the means through which absolution could be achieved. In the preface to his translation of the Chronicle, Jerome also advocates pilgrimage to the Holy Land, claiming that those, quote, who have seen Judea with their eyes will gain clear insight into the scriptures. However, despite Jerome's opinions about visiting the holy city, he upholds the attitude that there is no particular reason to live or pray in Jerusalem, since God is everywhere and believers hold the temple within them. This belief also became a problem when the first Crusaders captured Jerusalem in 1099, but nobody wanted to really remain there. With the Muslim conquest of the city in the early 7th century, the Balian doctrine, which argued for the superiority of the heavenly Jerusalem, asserted itself further. Under Muslim control, Jerusalem became connected to a greater extent to the eschaton and the apocalypse. Oracles and Christian apocalyptic work began to arise in this period. Christian attitudes toward the city of Jerusalem in the early patristic period can be therefore summarized as follows. The city, with its many new churches and monuments, became a locus for pilgrimage and marked the presence of a Christian Jerusalem based on a rejection of Jewish practice. As a result of pilgrimage, the city of Jerusalem also became recognized as a sacred city for the European Christian world, and the concept of the eschaton and the apocalypse became linked to Jerusalem. After the conquest of the city in 638 by Caliph Omar, the considerations of Jerusalem as an earthly city were made even more inferior to its status as heavenly. Jerusalem's position in Christian thought leading up to the medieval period paralleled the views of the Latin Church toward lamentation. The Latin Church persisted in associating lamentation with non-Christian behavior. Lamenting a city and laments in general were translated by the Church as a genre associated with a pagan past. To lament a city such as Jerusalem was to establish a preference for the physical city over the ethereal. Public lament and sermons and funeral orations were therefore rejected by the early Church Fathers, arguing that true grief should be measured and moderate because believers would reunite in the heavenly afterlife. Christian practices attempted to shift the meaning of death as not an end, but as the means to an afterlife. The practice of lamentation, though continued greatly in the secular realm, was believed to act against the understanding that the separation between the living and the dead was temporary. Saint Ambrose publicly repudiates lamentation practices, arguing for the excessively feminine and sexual nature when he describes women tearing up their garments, disheveling their hair with their filth, and publicly displaying their anguish. In his homilies, John Chrysostom describes the performative dirges of women in public lamentation, their wailing, the tearing of their hair, the intense movement of their arms as shameful. The Church Fathers therefore formulated doctrines that substituted practices of lament. They promoted the repressing of the natural practice of grieving. For example, in his Confessions, Augustine accepts the difficulty of his mother's death, but decides to repress the desire to lament, and instead rejoices through singing the Psalms. And in his Life of Solon, Plutarch claims Solon attempted to curb women's disorderly and unbridled expressions of grief by restraining breast beating and lamentation and prohibiting them from lacerating their bodies. Rejection of the practice of lamentations as it pertained to pagan and Jewish origins was further reflected in Christian doctrine through the lack of commentaries and translations of the Book of Lamentations. Lamentation and the Arabo-Islamic tradition. The relationship of the Arabo-Islamic world to lamentation and the city of Jerusalem has a far-reaching history. Elegies devoted to fallen cities, the Rita al-Mudun, were influenced primarily by established traditions of the pre-Islamic world, the area termed the Jahiliyyah, often translated as the Age of Ignorance, the time before the advent of Islam. Since most of the pre-Islamic world was examined through an Islamic reconstruction of its past history, evidence of lamentation is difficult to trace in the written tradition. In its efforts to distinguish itself from its pagan and Jewish neighbors, lamentation was also a practice rejected early on by Islam. The identity of the Ummah, the Islamic community, was to set itself up against the pre-Islamic Jahiliyyah society, and this included the realignment of rituals devoted to the dead. Lamenting, or niyaha, was considered incompatible with the Islamic belief of salvation. To negotiate one's faith was seen as a rebellious act against God's judgment. Death was only the end of a period of testing, a transition necessary to reach the afterlife. The practice, primarily again undertaken by women, was also forbidden by Muhammad at an early stage of Islam. Not only the display of grief, but also the actions of tearing one's hair and clothes, striking and scratching the face and body, and shaving of the head. Muslim exegesis and the Islamic hadith tradition, sayings attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, reflect a negative attitude toward female lamentation and its practices. Muhammad is also believed to have explicitly condemned the work of the Nawaye, the professional mourners, claiming that the deceased would be punished if they were present. Lamenting the dead, al-niyaha ala al-mayit, was singled out by Muhammad as one of the pre-Islamic customs that all Muslims had to abandon, also including the attacking of ancestral lineage and summoning the planets for rain. As Nadia Maria al-Sheikh work on the topic tells us, the emerging Muslim community replaced the private and unofficial modes of mourning attributed to women with official, institutionalized spheres, while male poets were allotted the task of expressing the community's reaction to loss. Despite these types of rejections, The secular Arabo-Islamic world saw a number of laments devoted to cities. These laments help us understand the poetics of loss and nostalgia and the way in which constructed textual spaces feed and satisfy symbolic, cultural, and political imaginations. The majority of surviving lamentations actually come from Muslim Spain. However, we also have a lamentation for the loss of Jerusalem to the first Crusaders by the court poet Ibn al-Abawardi, where he writes, "To shed tears is a man's worst weapon, where the swords stir up the embers of war. How can the eyes sleep between the lids at a time of disaster that would waken any sleeper? The Gimrahi, the hardship of war, has penetrated the lives of all, including the Dumya, or the girls, who out of shame hide their beauty in their wrists." Ibn al-Abwardi's poem utilizes common tropes of ancient city lamentations, such as the fall of the city based on the sins of the population and their movement away from the faith. The description of the events of war and destruction in the city as a female lover who has often also departed, the call for the believers to recapture the city, and the evocation of a once glorious past as a means of reflecting on the current lamentable state of Jerusalem. These tropes resemble those found in ancient Mesopotamian city laments and the Hebrew Bible, and they reflect Islam's supersession of both Christianity and Judaism. The term tahrif, meaning distortion or alteration, is used to express the belief that Islam supersedes Christian and Jewish scripture as the final and most authentic expression of Abrahamic monotheism. Irmiya or Jeremiah is present in Islamic literature and exegesis, and his stories closely resemble the accounts of the Hebrew Bible. Muslim literature also accounts the destruction of Jerusalem that resembles those in the Book of Lamentations. Lamentation or Vokh and the Eastern Christian Church, the Cilician Armenians. The lament or the Vokh became a popular social and political genre in the Armenian tradition, allowing the community to come to terms with many disasters, including the devastation of large cities. Short prose lamentations appear among early Armenian historiographies. Davtak Kertol's Lament for the Death of the Great Prince Zevanshen from the 7th century also includes oratorical expressions and amalgamations that draw from ancient city lamentations. Whereas early laments in Armenian were either written in prose or included among long historiographies, from the 12th century onward, the dominant form of laments were poetic works, usually composed by upper ecclesiastical figures that utilized many of the tropes of lamenting cities in the ancient world. Aha tsainem tsain vochbakin, gagan parnam ardasvakin, as tseres tsekem hergir verin, tarnam chosim yergir nerkin. Gochem as yergusus ant miagin, linel sekagits imos ansin, batmem as vishtas im derdmakin, asem as tavas im lalakin. So begins Jerusalem's lamentation in Middle Armenian, reacting to the fall of the city in 1187 to the great Islamic leader, Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, better known as Salah ad-Din in Western Europe. In 1189, 2 years after the capture of the city, the Gatoligos, or High Patriarch of all Armenians, Krikor IV Dagha, composes his creation of over 4,000 poetic lines, Asatsial ban Vochberkagan, Vasen Arman Yerusagami, the poem of lamentation over the capture of Jerusalem. Grigor's poem, told from the point of view of the fallen city of Jerusalem, begins with a declaration of mourning, later calling for others to join in bewailing the city's loss to Salah ad-Din. Behold, I exclaim the lamentable sound. I lament all in tears. I'll leave my strength to the heaven above. I turn to speak to the earth below. I call the two instead of one. To become the mourner of my being, I narrate my melancholic anger. I tell of my weeping pain. There are 4 existing city laments in Armenian in the medieval period. The Vokh Bietesio, or Lament on Edessa, composed by the High Patriarch Nerses Chinorali, Nerses the Gracious, after the loss of the Crusader Principality Edessa to Nur al-Din Zengi in 1144. And of course, all of us know that this poem is considered as one of the most celebrated poems in all of Armenian literature. Khajadur Gesadetsi, a nobleman from the medieval Proshans, mourns the losses endured in Greater Armenia by the invasion of the Mongols in his lament over the loss of eastern lands. and Stepanos Orbelian's elegy over the Holy Cathedral of Echmiadzin, a poem mourning the destruction of the ancient Armenian Cathedral of Echmiadzin by the Mongols, can also be considered a city lament because of the ways in which it draws on characteristic features of the genre. We don't have many recorded city laments from the medieval period, but the ones we do have offer us a spectrum through which we can trace the development of this beautiful poetic genre across the medieval Mediterranean world. Collectively, they display the interconnectivity of the Mediterranean world and the shared practices across different ethno-religious cultures and religions. In my analysis of the ways in which various ethno-religious cultures lamented Jerusalem across the medieval Mediterranean during the period more commonly referred to as the Crusades, in chapter 2, I examined the 19 lines of the Arabic lamentation over the loss of Jerusalem by Ibn al-Abawardi, which I frame within the greater context of the Arabo-Islamic tradition of the Ritha al-Mudun, Abbasid court poetry, and the aforementioned discussions of the trajectory of lamentation in the Arabo-Islamic culture. In chapter 3, I examined European sources of the same battle over Jerusalem by considering the 5 surviving accounts of Pope Urban II's speeches at the Council of Clermont, the speech believed to be the driving force behind the movement of European armed pilgrims to Jerusalem in the 11th century. Here I argued that despite Christian beliefs and practices that associate lamentations with a Judaic and pagan past, these sources positioned their historiographies into a model of lamentation that assumes the reconquest of a once Christian city, a Christian Jerusalem already in a state of mourning. This chapter also concludes by arguing that the conquest of Jerusalem by the European Crusaders resulted in a brief shift in theological approaches to the city of Jerusalem and to the practice of lamentation, where earthly Jerusalem received a higher status than it had in the past, a status that further paved a justification for its conquest by the Latin Church. Moving forward to a period of once again contested Jerusalem, in chapter 4, I examine the aforementioned lamentation of Krikordra over the capture of Jerusalem by Saladin. Through the point of view of the city as female, Jerusalem laments its loss to Saladin by providing a map of the world in the Tio model that establishes a genealogical connection between the Armenians and the city of Jerusalem. This connection allows the lament to then present the city's hero and savior as the Armenian prince Levon, the future king of the independent kingdom of Armenian Cilicia. The political agenda of the lament is highlighted through its reliance on common tropes attributed to lamentation as a means of demonstrating Jerusalem's loyalty to the Roman papacy, as Levon and Dra were exchanging letters in the period for the upcoming Third Crusade and Cilician Armenian aid in exchange for the support of an independent kingdom. And in the final chapter of my book, I return this time to the Crusades of 1192, more commonly referred to as the Third Crusade or the King's Crusade. Here I consider the anonymous English chronicle, the Itinerarium Peregrinorum et Gesta Regis Ricardi, or regarding the itinerary of the pilgrims and deeds of King Richard, and one of its source texts, the Anglo-Norman verse chronicle, The History of the Holy War. I argue that with the inability of Richard the Lionheart and the Crusaders to reconquer the city of Jerusalem, comes the regression to earlier models of considering the position of Jerusalem and lamentation, where the attitudes refer to the early patristic fathers, where the heavenly Jerusalem is the one that should be considered in Christian thought. Though Jerusalem is not reconquered, by Richard and the Crusaders, the text does not present the city as loss. Loss and lamentation are translated not as the inability to conquer the earthly Jerusalem, but the obstacles and sinful nature that prohibits the pilgrims from entering the heavenly. The city lament is positioned between the reality of a tangible loss and the memory of the same loss, informing an expression of mourning. My interdisciplinary study hopes to set further conversations on the theme of city laments, particularly also on the shifting role of women in lamentation practices. And here I return back to the poem Getron that I started at the beginning of this talk. And if you reap it, you will create, you birth it, it guides you. Isn't that the center? And if it moves, it changes, a ray of light. Is it possible to know where is the center? And if you go, you will return. It's lasting. Would you have wanted to know, is this the center? And if you forget, you'll remember. It's eternal. Would you have asked, are you the center? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Boyadjian. So we'll have an opportunity now for questions and answers. If you have a question you'd like to ask, you can use the question and answer function in the Zoom. It should be there, easy for you to find, and you can go ahead and put together some questions. Okay, so you can do that. If you're using the chat, I can monitor that also, but I'm going to be looking at the question and answer. I had a question just to start off while people are perhaps writing down some questions. Does it seem that the genre of the Lamentations really peaked in the medieval period, or does that continue as a form of expression later? Let's go into early Renaissance and Renaissance period. And are there other examples of other cities that became such a focus?
Thank you, Barlow. I mean, I think the practice of lamentation is universal and timely. Like, I don't think it goes out of fashion, you know, because we can witness the ritual of lament like every day. You know, if we go into different communities, there are different ways in which the practice of lamentation is happening. And so one of the things about I wouldn't say that it peaked necessarily maybe in the medieval period, because the other important thing is that, of course, if there are these laws that were in place in, like, let's say the religious world, right? And so in religious law, it didn't mean that the people or the secular world stopped doing it, right? And so because the practice is a ritualistic practice and also an oral practice, we don't have that many documented kind of lamentations. And so it's like, for me, when I was doing my archival research and my research on lament, I couldn't find that many that were written down in the period, right? But if I were to talk to, let's say, people, or think about the secular world, like or if you looked at, I talked to some art historians, like, that practice is very much there and prominent. So I think it's interesting to think about it as something that is a practice of thinking about loss and death, right? And the way that human society across different colors and religions thinks about and has to process this idea of loss, right? And negotiating this notion of death, and like, what happens when, you know, somebody we love dies, and then what do we do with the pain of that, right?
Right.
And
Great.
so translating that to a city is really interesting, because a community is so tied. You know, if we look at kind of nomadic cultures, they talk about space, and then that shifts to cities. So it's interesting to think about that personification of a space or city, because that personification allows almost for it to be mourned, right? And that mourning to happen. Yeah.
So we have some questions, and Dr. Laporta has a question. He says, I was wondering whether this carried on to the laments on the fall of Constantinople.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, to follow up on your question, right, about other cities, that's the falls of Constantinople and the ways in which those laments are discussed or composed are very similar. So that one of the major arguments then in my book is that if we look at the role of lamentation, a lot of these major tropes are like exist across different cultures and different cities. And so you could definitely see parallels in the fall of Constantinople. And then, there's really actually the most documented city laments that we have come from Muslim Spain. So cities like Cordova, we have poetry that is written about it, and there's a lot of scholarship on that too. Yeah, thank you, Sergio. Thanks very much.
Yeah, there's another question. It's regarding St. Gregory of Naddai, since he wrote a book of Lamentations. Is there any evidence that you know of that he comments on Jerusalem in his work? Are you familiar with anything in there? Maybe out of your area, but it's just a question that.
Yeah, no, I actually have been thinking a lot about Kuko Nadegatsi's Book of Lamentations. If anybody is aware of the answer to that, I'm really interested. I see that book as a mystical book that's thinking about the idea of loss and self-reflecting, and this idea of how to be a believer in kind of, and these notions of spirituality. That's a wonderful question, and I'm actually really interested in looking more into it. And I've been more and more interested in thinking about Naregati. So I'm sorry if that didn't necessarily answer the question, but
Yeah, it's open for more research. Here's another question. It's actually from Ardeen, Nora Chapman. Do writers of medieval Armenian lamentation about Jerusalem show signs of having read Josephus's War, which laments the destruction of Jerusalem in 70?
yeah, that's actually a wonderful question. Thank you so much. I'm not exactly sure if they show signs of it, as in like evidence, but because of just the parallels that exist between Josephus War and the destruction of Jerusalem in 70, and because of the genre itself, we could say arguably that it was something that they knew about or had read. But this particular lament and destruction of Jerusalem is very important actually in an English text called the Siege of Jerusalem that appears in the medieval period. I want to say in the 11 somethings, but it becomes the basis for which this particular anonymous writer talks about this precursor, Josephus War, as a way of thinking about the place of England and its relationship to Jerusalem. So that text is actually a really interesting one in that regard, and particularly with that later text of the Siege of Jerusalem.
So one of our audience writes that 60 years ago, they had attended an Armenian funeral in Burj Hamud in Beirut, Lebanon, and she witnessed professional lamenters wailing the death of a community member. Where did that tradition come from?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you for that example. And I think that we could see that kind of, lamenting and wailing across a number of communities. I was recently talking to a friend of mine from Haiti who was talking about similar ways in which the practice of ritual lament is still, something that is very prominent. So I think that tradition comes from what I was trying to outline in my talk. And it comes from just ancient cultures that think about mourning and loss, and that the power that was given to understand loss and mourning was initially ascribed to women and professional, right? Like I was giving some examples of professional wailers who was really their job to come and help people mourn and grief and think about loss and death.
And I'm kind of surprised by that, because I think what she's talking about is at a popular level, but I think the Armenian church especially sort of tried to suppress that tradition at a very early period, right? They tried to suppress the idea of lamenting, professional lamentations. They shouldn't, strike yourselves and everything like that. So it's interesting it continued in a popular way like that. I have
Yeah. Because also I think that the ritual is a practice that, because it maintained itself in the secular world, it also could be argued as something cultural. Now, maybe, continuing to to harm oneself, like those kind of things are not necessarily, something that's practiced, but the idea of crying or lamenting or showing sorrow, right? I think becomes interesting because in some ways, like some cultures or society almost thinks about not allowing for that practice. But if you're around like someone or a group of people that are really crying or wailing, that really is very moving, right? It brings something to the people around them. Like I was saying in the Athenian world, right? Like there were laws against women lamenting because the men weren't going to war. They were just, according to the Athenians, like getting into their feelings. So there is something very powerful in the idea of communal lament. And I think that's why it became something that was also threatening to a lot of, patriarchal orders and male social orders because of the very power that it entailed in its community and its community of women.
Okay, we have another question. Do you think we've lost the practice of lamentation as a ritual and as a form of mediation between women and the gods? If so, what are the possible effects?
Hi, Tarfia. Thank you for the question. Um, I don't know. I mean, I think this idea of lamentation or sorrow is a very interesting one. I think the 19th century and the idea of empire and colonialism shifted a lot of ways in which people thought about the world and humanity. But also, recently I was thinking about when we have, when people talk about like invalidating language, let's say, or toxic positivity. And some of the ways in which, that is, um, talked about is like, get over it, why are you sad? Life isn't so bad. And I was thinking about how so much of that kind of attitude and like stance and the negativity that is given to expressing emotions, right? Like, so Plato talks about like women as overly emotional, right? And men as logical. And this kind of binary that's created in society, particularly ascribed to also gender. I was thinking about how that kind of toxic positivity is so tied to this idea of maybe even capitalistic society where, trying to get through the workday or trying to, get some like a working person to not really think about their emotions or feelings, but to kind of work like machines is like, well, get over it. You plug through it. Um, I think different cultures have also maintained lamentation in different forms um, based on their kind of historical, like historical and cultural history. Um, but I think that the lament itself and the kind of outward wailing is in most societies maybe frowned upon. I don't know. I mean, it's I think a very individual question and maybe even a culturally specific question. Um, but I do think that the kind of inhibiting of that power um, between women and the gods, and also between women and their ability to, it was not only the gods, but their connection to nature, right? And the natural law through ritual was definitely part of, I think, a male patriarchal kind of power push, because like I was mentioning, that kind of communal power among women, so much so that, they had to adopt a tongue like Emisil, right? The tongue of women, or they had to cross dress as women, right? I think that um, was definitely very threatening, and we could see that in the scholarship. Yeah, that's right. Many indigenous American groups practice collective wailing after death. I mean, I think that many different cultures practice it. Um, and one of the things that I'm actually trying, I would really invite or solicit anybody who's interested, is that I am really interested in putting a volume together on the topic of female lamentation and lamentation across different groups, and thinking about the way in which different cultures think about loss and lamentation. So, and that's kind of the next steps of where I'm going, and thinking about bringing people together in order to actually answer more of Tarfia's question and some of the other questions that were raised here, and this idea of the practice of lamentation and the role of women in these practices.
Great. I had one more question I was thinking about, the idea of the appropriation of the women who used to be the lamenters. It seems like in the three traditions you talked about, Arabo, Islamic, and then Christian, and then Armenian, did it happen around the same time that they began to appropriate and span the women, and then say, men have to take over the roles and do it in a slightly different way? Or I don't know.
I mean, my work is obviously more on the medieval world, but um, like one of the things that we can see is it coincided with the rise of monotheistic religions.
Right.
And so, whereas before the idea of multiple gods and negotiating a culture or a society's death or deaths in their and then cities was with multiple gods, there was a different kind of relationship that started getting established when there was a monotheistic God, right? And what that relationship entailed. So
Very good. Well, I would like to thank Dr. Boyadjian for a very interesting presentation. We'd like to follow her work and see her next work. And so thank you very much for speaking to us this evening and presenting on your book, The City Lament. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Barlow. Thank you for having me, and thank you for the wonderful questions and for those of you that attended.
And would like to just invite everyone that this Sunday, September 27th at 4 p.m. In California, but 7 p.m. on the East Coast, there's going to be a presentation on Bedros Keljik's Armenian American Sketches. It's originally written in the Armenian language, translated to English. It's a fascinating book of short stories about the Armenians in the early 20th century. So join us for that talk. Thank you and good evening, everyone. We'll see you later. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.